Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the event Dislocation and Crowns on behalf of the Department of Art History as Cultural History, which is led by Professor Bénédicte Savoie. This is the final session of this semester's KuK Tuesdays Dislocation series. My name is Iñigo Salto Santamaría, a research associate here at the Technical University of Berlin, and I'm very delighted to have you all here. Today's session is co-curated by my dear colleague Mikaél Assilkinga and myself, and the session focuses on objects of power, with a central question at the very heart of our conversation today. What can we learn from when we look at crowns, regalia, and other power objects held in European museums from a transnational perspective? With the help of our guests, Tevodai Mambai from the Museum der Kulturen Basel and the University of Bern, Falk Quenstedt from the University of Greifswald, and Feng Schöneweiß from the Max Planck Institute of Art History in Florence, will explore these objects of power across different geographies and chronologies. And we will pay particular attention to the shared fate of Cameroonian and German regalia in European museum settings. And we will also discuss the methodological challenges, but also possibilities that arise from this approach. The idea of this session comes from the work Mikaél and I did while writing our thesis here at the TU Berlin, on very different topics, I might add. Mikaél wrote his thesis on Cameroonian objects of power. His research looked at the fate of objects and subjects, such as the royal throne of Bamum, Manduyeno, which is now on display at the Humboldt Forum here in Berlin, and you can see it on the left side of the image. And meanwhile, I focused on the reception and display of European medieval art in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, including the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, which you can see on the right side of the image. I explored the nationalistic appropriation of this particular object by the Nazis, its claimed restitution from Vienna to Nuremberg in 1938, and its re-restitution to Austria in early 1946 in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, in our postdoctoral positions, Mikaél at the Linden-Museum in Stuttgart as a research associate, and me here at the TU, we have continued this dialogue that began already during our time as doctoral students, and this dialogue has taken the form this semester of a master's seminar on objects of power, and this discussion with our three distinguished guests marks the culmination of this very exciting project. And now I'm very delighted to pass the word over to Mikaél, who will tell you more about our conclusions and about our seminar at large. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Iñigo, for your introductory words. I would like also to thank our students who have attended the meeting, and then recognize also the presence of Professor Maris from the Embassy of Cameroon, who is here tonight, on all our colleagues from the Institute and also from the Berlin Ethnological Museum, who have supported us a lot during our seminar. And the idea during the seminar was to examine a trans-regional and transnational comparison between Cameroonian and German objects and symbol of power and their force extraction, invisible presence, different forms of visualization, and their institutional musealization. One of the main aims of our seminar was to examine together with our students these objects in their worldly, spiritual, and material dimension, and to critically reflect the challenges always as well as the potential of such an intercultural comparison. And we have selected some pieces of work, like you can see on the slide on the screen. And those examples are from of objects that are custodied here in Berlin in some museums, the Ethnological Museum and then Kunstgewerbe Museum, and others are custodied in Stuttgart, where the students also visited me in Stuttgart with my colleague Iñigo, where we have been in the Linden-Museum and then the how do you call it again? The Landesmuseum Baden-Württemberg. So thank you so much. And we have kept in working on the overarching issues relating to the contextualization, provenance, and of course, the debate of the restitution concerning all those objects. Of course, it is not always evident to speak about comparison concerning objects that are not coming from the same background. On the one hand, you have objects that come from a colonial context, that is European context, colonial context in Africa, and other European objects that have been in several countries in Europe and that are now in Germany, like the crown you see on the screen. But once we move beyond the sometimes purely methodological consideration, we could realize that we quickly find similarities, functions, and even new meanings that can be derived from comparison. And during the process with our student, we have also questioned comparison as a methodological approach in art history. Due to its complex nature, the concept of comparison needs to be explored continuously, and I think that tonight we can have, again, the insight of an expert we have invited that is seated on the podium with us. In general, German and European museums are filled with objects of power. In their diversity, they collectively present a dignified perspective on a glorious past, and in some cases still living cultures. They are costly materials reflecting prestige and authority. At the same time, these museums have amassed, stored, and now display regalia that were violently seized from other cultures in the context of colonialism, like I said before. These collections are embedded in debates about restricted access, loss of function, and possible restitution. Questions of legitimacy and restitution surrounding objects of power cut across institutional boundaries, affecting both Europe and Africa, in our cases, mostly Germany and Cameroon. Restitution debates have been shaped nationalistic claims around key artifacts such as the regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, now housed in Vienna. Yet recent development in these discussions have led to the temporary reactivation of certain artifacts, as seen in the case of the Manduyenu in Humboldt Forum during the visit of the Sultan of Bern here in Berlin. So I would like now to say a few words about the KuK Tuesday sessions. It is a mini conference roundtable that we used to organize at our Department of History here in Berlin. And we all together with our guests and our speakers explore transcultural approaches to objects of power, especially for this session across different geographies and contexts, like Iñigo mentioned it already, with a particular focus on the shared fate of Cameroonian and German regalia in museum settings. By examining these objects through the lens of their materiality and their presence in European institutions, we will discuss tonight how regional and national histories are constructed through objects of power, as well as the interplay between the sacred, the politics, and the secular in the original context and after their musealizations. Our aim is to move beyond comparison based on original function and instead explore the methodological challenges and possibilities of a transcultural approach to objects of power and their provenance. We have structured this session of today in three main parts, where we'll have three speakers, and then they will give each of them an input of about 10 minutes. And one of the presentation is about Cameroonian context and its power objects delivered by our colleague Tevodai Mambai. One other presentation will be on European power objects. And then the last one will be on interdisciplinarity and transculturality of provenance research by Feng Schöneweiß. So now I would like to introduce one of our speakers, who is Tevodai Mambai. Tevodai is a Cameroonian PhD student at the University of Bern in Switzerland, where he is writing currently his dissertation entitled Die postkoloniale Repräsentation der Bergbewohnerinnen Nordkameruns und Nordostnigerias in deutschsprachigen Reise- und Missionsberichten. He is also fellow at the Museum der Kulturen Basel in Switzerland, where he carries out provenance research on the Paul Hinderling collection made up of Mafa cultural artifacts and ethnic group located in the actual far north region of Cameroon. So maybe we can just put our hands together to welcome Tevodai Mambai.
Thank you, Mikaél. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the two remaining panelists. Our second panelist, Falk Quenstedt, studied in Berlin, Jena, and Bergen, and holds a PhD from the Free University of Berlin. He wrote his dissertation on German travel accounts from around the year 1200 in the context of Arabic literature. He served as a visiting professor for German literature of the late Middle Ages and early modern period at the University of Hamburg during the winter semester of 2020-2021. And he also worked at the collaborative research center Episteme in Bewegung on the topic The Wonderful as a Configuration of Knowledge in Medieval Literature at the Free University of Berlin. And Falk is currently a research associate at the chair of Older German Language and Literature at the University of Greifswald. Thank you for joining us today, Falk. Let's give him a warm welcome. And finally, our third panelist, Feng Schöneweiß, studied art history in Nanjing and Shanghai and earned a PhD in East Asian history from the University of Heidelberg in 2023. His dissertation focused on the Chinese monumental vases at the Dresden State Art Collections and the history of 4 generations of German curators responsible for these artifacts, and I think we will hear a bit about that today. Feng has held positions at the Museum of Applied Arts in Frankfurt and the Berlin University of the Arts, and he is now a postdoctoral fellow at the 4A Lab, a collaboration between the Max Planck Institute of Art History in Florence and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation here in Berlin. And additionally, Feng is currently the inaugural Albert Ottenbacher Fellow for Provenance Research at the Central Institute of Art History in Munich. And it's a pleasure to have you here with us, Feng. Let's give him also a warm welcome. Perfect. Now that we have told you the goal of our session and who is talking, I'm happy to give the word to Tevodai, and let's get this event started. Tevodai, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to the audience, and thank you also to the institution that hosts this session. Excuse my English, and I think we will understand each other. I will focus my presentation on my experience as someone who has witnessed and contributed to research of provenance in German-speaking Switzerland, museums, and we have talked about Museum der Kulturen Basel, where I worked as a fellow. Switzerland was not officially a colonial power compared to, compared to its neighbors like Germany, Italy, or France. But there is no doubt some Swiss worked hand in hand with colonial masters and profited from colonialism. And if we see publications like the one of Patricia Puchet or Barbara Luthi, entitled Postcoloniale Schweiz, or the current exhibition at the Linden-Museum in Zurich, we see how implicated was Switzerland in colonialism. And you can see it also in in the topic I'm going to talk about, Cameroon. Cameroon is a large country with about 260 ethnic groups. And my presentation, as introduced, will focus on the northern part of the country, especially the far north. And it is very diverse, demographically, geographically, or religiously spoken. It consists of plains, hills, and mountains, and the climate is semi-arid with 2 seasons, rainy and dry season. Many ethnic groups coexist together, among which we have the Vutes, the Mafas, the Gizigas, the Madas, the Podokos, the Gidas, Mbums, Mufu, Kotoko, and so on. Their main crops are millet, peanuts, cotton, vegetables such as tomatoes and onions. And they also raise small and large livestock. They practice imported religions like Christianity and Islam, but quite a number of people practice ancestral beliefs, which consist of worshiping high spirits through the ancestors. My presentation focuses on the mountain groups, especially the Mafas, who were intensively visited by the Swiss between 1950 and 2010. Most of the objects from Cameroon that we find in Swiss museums in the German-speaking part of Switzerland come from these ethnic groups. And they were collected by Swiss at the end of the French colonization in Cameroon. Who were the main actors, the main collectors? We have, number 1, René Gardy, a Swiss traveler, teacher, journalist, and writer. During his career as a teacher, he was accused of abusing sexually teenagers, and he was found guilty of being pedophile and was condemned by the cantonal jurisdiction of Bern. And he was the leader of the expedition to North Cameroon. Through his various films, publications, and radio broadcasts, he left his mark on the image of Africa in Switzerland. And the University of Bern, where am I, accorded him in 1967 a honorary doctorate in ethnology for his travelogue entitled Mandara. He made a lot of travels in the mountains and collected a lot of objects that we can today find in Bernese historical museums and at the Museum Schloss Burgdorf. Number 2, Paul Hinderli. He was a Swiss ethnologist and he worked for the Ethnographic Museum in Basel and spent the rest of his career here in Germany at the University of Saarbrücken. He accompanied Gardy to the Mafa in 1953 and collected around 600 cultural objects for the museum, the Kulturen Basel. And his expedition was financed by Swiss banks and institutions. So you can find other objects, but what is important is to know how the connection was made to the Mafa people. It is important to know that there were in the Mafa zone some Swiss missionaries, and we have Gertrude and Hans Eichenberger, a married missionary couple from Bern, who was settled there 5 years earlier. And the connection was made through these missionaries. And what was the motivation behind the collections of Gardi and Paul Hinderlin? They said they wanted to document the traditional process of iron production, because the Mafas are known as iron producers. Second, they wanted to collect cultural and religious and artistic objects, artifacts and sculptures of native people in order to enable Europeans to experience the authentic art that they might have lost with the modernization of civilization. And if we see, this motivation is not different from the historical role of museums, I mean the European Museum, because European Museum is considered as a place where artifacts, sculptures, and non-European people were stored and exhibited. And this is why when you go to a European museum, you can find majoritarily the cultural objects from Asia, from Africa, from Australia, or Latin America. And it was originally a place where Europeans could see the deep difference between the so-called civilized people and non-civilized, or modern people and primitive people. Sorry. So, what were collected? We had weapons. These are describes are weapons, but these objects are describes are weapon. But let me say that the objects collected was to prove that the Africans, I mean the Mafa people, the Cameroonians, were primitive, were barbaric, were wild, and so on. So all the objects which were collected were linked with this and associated with these narratives. Weapons, they are, as I have said, to consider that they are barbaric and wild. But these objects which are considered like weapons are not exactly weapons. They are objects of defense, of play, of dance, of chasing, and so on. So if you consider that as weapons, it means, and compare it with guns, for example, which is the object is very dangerous for human being. Secondly, we have furnitures. These furnitures, they are made of leather, and to say with the narrative that these people are not very important, they have not invented something very special, and so on. We also have vessels which are made up of clay. And we have also religious objects to say that they are fetishists and animists and so on. But there are other categories of objects which are hypersexualized. I mean, which reflects the pure imagination of collectors. And this is, for example, what they called penis futural. Penis futural. And we find it in the Museum der Kulturen Basel in at Museum Schloss-Burgdorf, even here in Germany, in museum in Braunschweig, is there. Penis futural, to say that Africans are sexually unsatisfied and so on, with these narratives. We have other categories of objects, sorry. What they called hockey game. I don't know whether all of us are informed about hockey game. What is necessary for people to talk about hockey game? What is necessary? There is a necessary condition, sine qua non. What do we have to talk about hockey game? What should we have, I mean? Yes. And what do we have on the place? Huh? Yeah? What should you have? I'm not kidding. Little ball. Yes. Yes, a little ball. But what again? Ice. Thank you very much. Ice. So when we, I said we have a semi-arid climate. It means there is no ice in Africa, in Cameroon, North Cameroon. But the concept used to describe such a game is called hockey game. So this is a pure imagination which does not have to do with the reality. So most of these objects were collected, as I have said, in the 1950s. This was a crucial period of emancipation of Cameroon and African countries. Some Cameroonians were fighting against the colonial ideology of the French colonialists. And the cultural objects, these cultural objects convoy colonial narratives and historical stereotypes about Black Africans when they are exhibited. So we know narratives about Africa are among the negatives. And the seeds of this negativity about Africa are still being legitimized and perpetuated through museums till today. So if we see the method of collection, I can say some were bought, some were violently seized because of the colonial context, some were stolen through tricks, and they are culturally sensitive objects that I want to talk about. We have here the so-called vraie. Vraie is a salt jars. And the vraie stands for a materialization of the presence of our ancestors and forefathers. When a parent dies, some days after burial, the ngolda, that is the village priest, comes and through his know-how transfers the wandering soul of the deceased parent to such a jar. And the jar, which was called duldak, simple jar, take another function. It becomes vraie, that is inhabited soul jar. And when illness or misfortune strikes children or other family members, sacrifices are made to the soul, to the deceased, which resides in the jar. And offerings are also made at festivals and at Thanksgiving, and with a request for peace, happiness, health, fertility for the whole family. That is why in the Mafa tradition, my own tradition, when a parent dies, normally we do not say, may his soul rest in peace, but we say, Paudi Audai Hingaya Ahud Gingaya. That is, watch over the children and the family. The second one is the dark one. It's called Gedpat's son personal spirit. The Gedpat is responsible for individual well-being. It is made up by Ngozngwalda, blacksmith wife, when the child is 6 or 7. And it has the same meaning, I can say, because there are offerings, there are, in time of danger, you fetch your get parts and make a ceremonial offering to him. As a child, you can sacrifice to your get parts alone or with friends and so on. So, coming back to the topic, crowns and dislocation. And when I don't know who formulated the theme, but when we see the theme, the topic, there is a certain accent on the importance of on the value or on the materiality of crowns. The materiality of the objects I have talked about is not costly. They are not visibly objects of prestige. They are not gleaming like gold. They do not manifest earthly authority or power, but they are very important in their metaphysical and spiritual function. They are objects that create a link between this world and the next. There are altars through which people in the living world have access to their dead relatives and through their offerings and prayers. The collection have not only the attribute of power, but also that of transcendental and metaphysical connotation. That is why if we read the travelogues of René Gardy, he said, I quote him, de Mafa konnte man damals nicht mit Bargeld locken. Es ist ganz unmöglich, ohne Gewalt einen bewohnten Krug in einem Gehöft zu erwerben. So wie, und die letzte Lösung war dann, die braven Leute unter Druck zu setzen, ihre Gefühle zu verletzen oder ein paar frei zu stellen. So, let me, before I finish, say a certain word about research of provenance. The museums have to update their data bank with, or by involving communities of origin. It should intend to promote many perspectives, deconstruct racist and colonial narratives with connection to the objects. It should give the community of origin the opportunity to define themselves and to appropriately document their objects, names, function, material, the relevance of the objects into the context and so on. There are many narratives about Africa. In literature, we have positive narrative. In films, there is change. In politics, there is change in narratives. They are updated. So even the museums have to shift and to become more and more positive in their narratives, in deconstructing the racist narratives that were linked and associated to the objects. Museums have a big task as far as research of provenance is concerned. There is a need to change the narrative from within. When it is done, objects can be interpreted with transcultural perspective. They can be described beyond the boundaries and become real topic of knowledge regardless of their materiality, function, and value. And I have to give a small example. I participated to the exhibition at the Museum of Kulturen, Basel. And we exhibited some jars I have presented. And after the exhibition, I had the response from various people. And the first one is from Julia Horn. Julia Horn is a colleague. She made her own jar, soldier, and sent me the picture. That is what you can see on the. So this, because it is well described, because it has the perspective of those who made it, those in the culture in which it is relevant, it can inspire others, and that's why Julia Horn was inspired. The second one is the one of Regula Hurton, and she make a picture of the jazz and organized in Solothurn her own exhibition with various pictures. And I asked her, why did she do it? And that is the reason she gave me. Seit einiger Zeit interessiert mich der Umgang mit den eigenen Vorfahren. Einige meiner letzten Arbeiten habe ich auch mit diesem Thema gewidmet. Nach meinem Empfinden stellt der Seelenkrug nun auf besonders eindrückliche Weise die Interaktion mit den Ahnen dar. Und indem für die Seele der verstorbenen Person einen Raum bietet und ihr dadurch gleichsam wieder eine irdische Präsenz verleiht, nimmt der Seelenkrug auch Bezug zur übergeordneten Dachstock, also Thematik der Ausstellung. Körper im Raum, Körper als Raum. So, just to end, when colonial and racist narratives are deconstructed, even exhibited objects can impact profoundly the visitors. And it can give them the possibility to be aware, to make a decision, and to be creative and so on. I have witnessed the coming of the delegation of my own people, Cameroonians, who came to Switzerland in November 2024. And they came because Switzerland has invited them. And the central question was the question of restitution. But I remembered what my uncle has told me. I can put it. He said, when you are invited to a feast, you can just dance and eat. You cannot command. So there are many questions associated with the question of restitution. Who speaks? Who makes a statement about restitution? Who scheduled the program? How do communities pose the problem? Is there a debate, a discussion in the communities of origin? What is the opinion of politics, of leaders, of men, of women, of youth? Is there any discussion in schools, in the universities, in institutions? Do communities have the appropriate infrastructure to welcome the artifacts? These are questions that we have to handle in order to talk about real restitution. And why are we focusing on a certain number of objects and selected objects and leave others? Why not all? There are many questions. Thank you for your kind intention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tevodai, for your great input. I personally am very happy that you are here tonight, because then you can also speak about the northern parts or northern cultures of Cameroon, because in the research concerning Cameroon here in Germany, we have a huge gap. That is the representation of the Sawa region or the grass field, which is also good. But then on the other side, we have not research carried out about these northern cultures. So I'm very happy that we have now begun to really fill in the gap. It will take time. Still, you are speaking about Switzerland. That is not Germany. But maybe, yeah, we can consider it as the German-speaking space, and then speak about Cameroonian cultural artifacts in those museums. You have raised a very interesting question, especially at the end of your presentation. I think that we will have so many questions. Maybe prepare your question, because we open at a certain time the debate with the publicum up so that you can ask your question directly also to Tevodai. He has mentioned some objects as war objects, spiritual objects, and then you have spoken about the transcendental dimension of those objects, which point is also very interesting. But now we have to move to hear first the second input of our guest, and then we give the floor to Falk. So Falk, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Tevodai, for your presentation and for the kind introduction and the invitation, and everyone involved who made this possible. It's a really nice setting to talk about academic and more than academic questions. I focus on the imperial crown that we already saw on Iñigo's slides at the beginning. And there it is again. The imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, part of the imperial regalia, is currently housed in the imperial treasure in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum there. The crown is octagonal in shape, comprising 8 gold plates joined by hinges. A later added arc and cross rest atop it. 4 smaller plates bear enameled biblical images, while 4 larger ones are adorned with gemstones and pearls. The arrangement of these gemstones carries biblical symbolism, referencing the heavenly Jerusalem and the apostles. This reflects the convergence of old and new eras, as well as the union of earthly and heavenly rule, a program of Christological kingship. The time and place of its manufacture remain debated. While earlier attributions connected to Otto I, Emperor Otto I, in the second half of the 10th century, most scholars date it to the reign of Conrad II in the early 11th century. Possible production sites include the Lower Rhine, west southern Germany, Sicily, Lombardy, or even Byzantium. Recent research suggests strong ties to Mediterranean craftsmanship, particularly from southern Italy and Byzantium, positioning the crown as both an adoption of and a response to the artistic and imperial traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire. A particularly intriguing feature of the crown's history is the so-called orphan stone, in German der Weise, referenced since the 12th century. In his De Mineralibus, Albert the Great describes it as a light wine-colored stone set in the crown, once believed to glow with its own light, a symbol of imperial honor, though its luminosity had faded already in the 13th century, obviously. Albertus names it the orphan due to its singularity. Since the 14th century, the stone is no longer mentioned in chronicle text and was likely replaced. In the following, I will examine 2 pivotal moments of dislocation of the crown in relation to the orphan stone, focusing on how the interaction between texts and historical objects contributes to the construction and performance of power. First, I examine the late 12th century adventure narrative Herzog Ernst, where the orphan stone first appears. My second focus is the publication from the context of Nazi Germany's 1938 transfer of the imperial regalia from Vienna to Nuremberg, where they were displayed as symbols of national identity. A key text in this context is Die Reichskleinodien by Heinrich Kohlhausen, the director of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum from 1937 to 1945. This work provides valuable insight into the ideological appropriation of the regalia during that period. And I start with Herzog Ernst, a medieval adventure narrative likely composed in the 12th century in the German vernacular. Unlike many other literary works of the time, it was not an adaptation of French or Latin pretexts. The tale remained popular with German-speaking audiences well into the 17th century or even into the 19th century. I discuss here the early version B, dating approximately to 1200. Set in the Ottonian era, so 250 years before its composition, the text recounts the struggles between Emperor Otto, who is shown as a rather weak king and emperor, and his stepson, Duke Ernst of Bavaria. Wrongly accused of treason, Ernst flees on a quasi-crusade, encountering, after a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, mythical lands and creatures, also the so-called monstrous races, which do not appear as wild in this text. They are rather more culturally advanced than the Germans who encounter them in the Far East, where he also acquires the orphan stone. Ernst obtains the stone while he is floating down an underground river, discovering it embedded in the ceiling of the cave. The narrator emphasizes the event's enduring significance, and I will read the High Middle German original, and you can take a look on the translation. Ernst der edle Wiegand einen Stein da untersach, den aus dem Felse brach. Der Stein gab viel Lichten Glast, den brachte sieht der werde Gast aus der filzstarken Freise. Davon ward der Weise durch sin Elende genannt. Es ist noch Hüte wohl bekannt, uf rieches Krone man in Sicht, von der lüget uns das Buch nicht. This passage illustrates the intricate interplay between material culture, political authority, and textual tradition. By referencing a tangible historical object, the narrative asserts its own veracity while simultaneously inscribing a new origin story onto the artifact, effectively enacting a process of symbolic and conceptual dislocation. The version B does not provide an account of how the stone was transferred or how it came to be incorporated into the crown. The later version D, from the late 13th century, then explicitly describes Ernst handing the stone over, but not to the emperor personally, but to the Rieche, the empire. Thus, the text seeks to inscribe the significance of the empire's princes into its very structure and operation. The orphan is also referenced in other literary texts of the time. In two of Walter von der Vogelweide's political poems, the stone is linked to Philip of Swabia's claim to power during the throne dispute of 1198. Here, like a star, the orphan provides guidance to the princes of the empire. Thus, Herzog Ernst and Walter ascribe rather divergent political significances to the stone. But where does this political symbolism of a unique gemstone come from in the first place? The art historian Avinoam Shalem and the literary scholar Hubert Herkammer have demonstrated its connection to Mediterranean traditions, particularly the Arabic al-yatima, which means also orphan, and Byzantine orphanos, terms used for unique pearls or gemstones symbolizing imperial sovereignty. Visual evidence from Byzantine and Norman regalia supports this interpretation, as seen in depictions of rulers wearing crowns featuring central red gemstones, as can also be seen on the so-called Holy Crown of Hungary, today displayed in the Hungarian parliament. So, just another example to add one more to the imperial crown. Herzog Ernst thus facilitates the symbolic appropriation of a Mediterranean emblem of power within the framework of German imperial ideology. While the text narrates the stone's westward journey, it deliberately omits its original cultural significance, instead redefining it as an oriental marvel acquired through the heroic exploits of a German duke. And that's something you could call a rebranding or a provenance branding if you would take up these terms by Stacy Pearson. I now turn to the Reichskleinodien by Heinrich Kohlhausen, a publication obviously designed to evoke admiration and convey a sense of reference for the regalia in the context of their transfer to Nuremberg. The book's grand folio format, high-quality plates and typography, inspired by late medieval southern German incunabula, evoke a pompous Germanic impression. The text, replete with superlatives and nationalist rhetoric, closely links the history of the imperial regalia with the fate of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and here with emphasis on German nation, highlighting both its glory days, its Glanzzeiten deutscher Kaiserherrlichkeit, and its times of deepest disgrace, Notzeiten tiefster Schmach. Kohlhausen even asserts a world historical uniqueness to this connection between people and object. And I quote, Nirgends sonst auf der Welt haben im Laufe eines so sagenhaft langen Zeitraumes Menschen ihr politisches Geschick derart durch ein Sachgut versinnbildlicht, wie es die Menschen deutscher Zunge mit dem Reichsschatz taten. In his description of the insignia, the author consistently emphasizes their supposed German, Germanic or Nordic qualities. While he attributes a Burgundian origin to the crown and recognizes the Byzantine influence in the enamel plates, he downplays their significance, positioning them as inferior in comparison to the gemstone jewelry, which he asserts aligns with Germanisches Herkommen, Germanic origin. However, the captions for the picture plates are less nuanced, categorizing the crown and by extension the other imperial insignia as German, West German, or Rhenish in origin. Notably, the term West German continues to be used on the website of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna today. Kohlhausen also provides an ideological reinterpretation of the orphan stone based on the poems by Walter. He attributes the legend of the luminescent gemstone to the crown's physical design, and I use very recent pictures here. Its large gemstones are set in open-backed mounds, allowing light to pass through, creating a luminous effect. For Kohlhausen, it is this optical phenomenon that inspired the legend, which in turn shaped, as he puts it, abertausend deutsche Menschen, thousands of German people's perception of the crown throughout history. Kohlhausen contends that Weise, the term Weise, orphan, in Walter's poem refers not to the single gemstone, but to the entire glowing crown which Philip of Swabia is to wear in the Führerlose Reich, the leaderless empire. He describes this as the first great testimony to the awakening of a national German idea, linking the orphan myth and the crown to the Führerkult. The same interpretative pattern is applied to Herzog Ernst, which stands in opposition to the text's actual political agenda. Kohlhausen's rhetoric here strongly resonates with the Heim ins Reich propaganda associated with the Austrian Anschluss and the subsequent transfer of the regalia to Nuremberg. He asserts that Ernst brings the stone home, Heim, to Emperor Otto from the east. In this context, the return of the regalia to Nuremberg in 1938 takes on a providential character, seemingly fulfilling a medieval myth. Consequently, the orphan stone, which comes to be understood as a metonym for the crown itself, is reimagined as distinctly German, as a distinctly German symbol. And I conclude, both Herzog Ernst and Kohlhausen's publication enact symbolic dislocations of the imperial crown and the orphan stone. The medieval text embeds the crown within a German framework, marginalizing its Mediterranean origins, but does so within the context of princely resistance to centralized imperial power in the time. Meanwhile, Kohlhausen's text aligns the regalia with Nazi ideology, employing the orphan stone to legitimize the Führerkult and root it in a supposed German imperial history. While Herzog Ernst tends to exoticize the stone, and by extension the crown, emphasizing the empire's universal scope, Kohlhausen highlights its distinctly regional and national identity. Both cases illustrate how historical objects are recontextualized to serve ideological ends, erasing their transcultural histories. They also demonstrate how interdisciplinary and transcultural provenance research can uncover complex entanglements, even in seemingly unambiguous objects of power like the crowns. So, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Falk, for this fantastic presentation and for engaging so well with the topic, the literal topic of the session, which are crowns. You have been able to, through the fantastic methodology, to show the weight of the perspectives on this object and also the fragility that entails every single interpretation of the crown. I'm so happy that you engaged not only with medieval sources, which are very unfamiliar to most of people here probably, but also with the modern, the 1939 text, which shows us that this object in all of its dislocations has been constantly the object of projections, and it's still today an object that is difficult to grasp because of its materiality and because we don't know where it was built in. Today, while preparing the presentation, I saw the exact same thing, that the Kunsthistorisches Museum still calls this object Westdeutsch, the same word that is used in the 1939 publication, and that is very, very interesting. And the last thing that I find that it's important to note is a stark contrast with Tevodai's very provocant and I think very important question about the fact whether objects of power have to be costly, and this is sort of the other end of the spectrum of this materiality sort of blinding our perception of the crown and sort of leading us through the orphan, a stone that we cannot even see, towards a meaning for this crown. So thank you for that. Now we will have our last presentation of the evening, and I hand over the mic to Feng. I look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's really my great pleasure to be here and to accept the invitation from Mikaél and Iñigo. And actually, I have been here sitting over there a lot of times, and sitting here is quite different and quite humbling. So I'm going straightforward into, if this is correct, yes. I'm going to talk about transculturality of provenance research. And actually, I have a subtitle, so it's called Benefits and Challenges of a Methodology. So the dislocation of power objects can generate transculturality. This means the power of translocated objects, especially those considered as crowns, either literally or metaphorically, can be interpreted from their significant roles as material evidence for cultural memory of diverse communities. And these include the communities of origin and the groups of people who enabled or carried out the dislocation by means of trade, by force, by violence. And my contribution focuses on another community, the provenance researchers, in cultural institutions such as libraries, museums, universities, many of you. And this approach is in line with what Frau Savoy and Frau Meyer and their colleagues and students have been doing here in this department. So provenance research does not merely trace the origin and transfer of objects of cultural or religious importance. It also actively fosters the emergence of new fields of scholarship, meanwhile transforming global objects into local cultural heritage. And I argue that the transculturality of provenance research is situated in its historical process and social action. This means to examine provenance research as connected and continuous episodes of cultural history and as a subject of the sociology of culture. I give this methodology a fancy name, provenance as method. I don't know if it actually works. It is a historiographical and relational approach of art historical provenance research. So in theory, it entails three connected methods. First, provenance as analytical evidence, which is an established method across different humanistic disciplines. And this provenance information can be excavated to substantiate the periodization of artworks, the approximate date of production of cultural objects, and so on. This method can be extended to review how global objects became material evidence of local cultural memory in different localities. And the second method is called the provenance research as a historical process. And this means to investigate how museum and heritage professionals carried out provenance research in their own historical and cultural contexts, and how the results of their provenance research prompted them to take actions. So this also means to examine how their provenance research had impacted on their own life and scholarship, as well as on the evolvement of scholarly fields. And the third is called provenance research as social action, which is quite familiar to many of us. This turns the study of provenance research into social history and sociology of culture. This also means to look into the multiple levels of motivation of provenance research, the various agenda pursued by different social actors, and the causes, effects, and the mechanisms of those social actions. And in practice, this methodology also means to examine the entangled biographies of the institutions of collecting and the objects in focus, provenance researchers, including those curators, librarians, heritage professionals, and so on, who are tasked with the specific objects or actually in their daily job. They also have to do provenance research on the side. And also, of course, this involves communities in a relational approach. Many different types of communities. So I've been reading from the text, and I'm going to show some pictures. Power objects. This is a power object. She's actually the curator of the Peabody Essex Museum, and when she's designing this whole new setting of Asian export art, she's holding up a cardboard printed out of a Chinese monumental vase. So this term, chinesische Monumentalvase, was invented by German curators in Dresden around the year 1900, and it was used to describe a group of very large porcelain objects from my periodization is from 1690 to 1715. Although the curators in Dresden have different idea. That's common, right? But the point is that they are quite tall. They're about 1 meter tall and about 50 kilograms in weight. They were the largest porcelain objects until the mid-18th century. And they were very inspiring for mice and craftspeople, and also for August the Strong, who collected them. And this object was the center of the realized. This is a virtual realization, but it is the same on site. This object looked into all those other objects. It had power. It still has power. And it has been used for different ways of commemorating different things and defining different communities' identities. And by this, I really mean that, for example, I keep that. The objects were exchanged they were originally in Berlin, in Oranienburg Schloss. And they were exchanged because August the Strong wanted to have these large objects. He had 600 dragoon soldiers in exchange for 151 Chinese porcelain, mainly large format, and these objects were among them. So, this story, just like Falk showed us some legends that were so important in defining different narratives, this story of exchange was also defined. This is the animation. I suggest everyone to have a look. It's really fun. How Auguste the Strong had a fascination and obsessed with porcelain from East Asia, but he was not really able to tell what is East Asia. He says Indian, he says Japanese, Chinese, whatever. But the point is, he wanted this. And this is his object of power. Although he had many other things, and he had a whole cultural scheme of superiority among his competitors for the crown, again, of Holy Roman Empire, he also wanted to be the emperor. And the porcelain was used by him as an exterior decoration of his big project of the Porzellanschloss to the north of the Elbe River, which is the first called the Dutch Palace and then called the Japanese Palace. And to do this, he exchanged and bought a lot of those identical, so-called identical objects in art history, well, in the history of decorative arts. And then he died. So this was not realized, but architects and architectural historians in Tevodai were able to virtually construct this big project. So eventually the Japanese palace would look like this. This is interior, inner court. And 24 of these objects would be put outside the building. So they are not inside on display, but outside. They are defining the building, instead of being defined by the building and space. And this became something that is defining for the cultural memory of these objects. This gentleman, Helmut Meissner, was an art collector in Dresden. So we're fast forwarding to 1982, when his door was knocked on by the Stasi agents and tax collectors, announcing that he had to pay a lot of money, or he had to give up his art collection. And we know that he was taken away and put into a psychiatrist. So he's basically locked up for a long time, and his collection were being considered to be on sale for in exchange for foreign currency. But when the Stasi were trying to do that, the museum professionals at the SKD, Staatliche Kunstsammlungen Dresden, they decided that we want to have this Meissen jug and this Chinese monumental vase because they are important for us, for the culture of the city, and also they were able to collaborate with cultural officials in Saxony to define this object as national wertvolles Kulturgut, so national cultural property of national significance. And that is the highest ranking among the objects in the register for German cultural heritage. This is a law from 1905, updated several times. So that effectively means that this object cannot be taken away from German territory. And by that, it actually meant it cannot be taken away from the DDR. And it stayed in Dresden. The Stasi had to subject this object to the museum, so the museum had it. And fast forward to 2006, Professor Gilbert Lupfer and his team actually solved this provenance case by simultaneously returning the object to the son of Herr Meissner and then buying the object back. So the object didn't move, but the ownership is now transferred to the museum, and the museum owns this object in a legitimate way. And this story, it seems like the provenance problem is solved, but actually the research just started. And that's the whole story of my dissertation. Now I'm turning it into a book that how Chinese porcelain became German cultural heritage. And in effect, there are a lot of this type of objects. Dresden has the most of them. There's none of them in China. All of them were made for Europe. First for Queen Mary II, but of course August the Strong wanted the best, and he had most of them. And these are the gentlemen I'm studying, and I'm sorry there was no female curator in Dresden until 1945, when the one on the right-hand side was a high Nazi official who fled to Bavaria, and he left a mess, but also he left some treasures in his office, that his photographs, his manuscripts. And it showed that these four long-term curators and museum directors actually, they transformed not only Chinese porcelain into German cultural heritage, but also the study of ceramics from something like Gustav Friedrich Klemm. He studied ceramics in his way as an antiquarian, but also he studied cultural history. So he decided that I should sell some of the duplicates in order to raise some funds to build a universal museum of ceramics made by people all around the world. And that was his generation's agenda, right? They wanted to write a universal history of something, of humankind. And then coming to Herr Gresser, he had a PhD in literary studies, and he was into studying legends. And he collected a lot of legends from Prussia and Saxony. Then eventually he found out that, oh, this object actually, this group of Chinese porcelain had a legend that is connected to our history and is so important. And through 20 years of research, he first found out the receipts of Saxon officials receiving the objects from Berlin. Then he went to Berlin and looked into the Geheimarchiv, secret archives of Prussia, and found out that some communication in the year from 1715 to 1717 actually took place, that there was a lot of negotiation until August the Strong was able to take the vases from Berlin. And then we look at Mr. Zimmermann, who was the first museum director in Dresden who had a PhD in art history. And he studied Chinese porcelain actually as art historical objects. And then when we move on to Fritz Fichtener, who studied Chinese art, Chinese objects, not only as history, but he actually brought up what is considered today object biography. So he wrote a manuscript on the dragon vases, telling the story of everything, of the exchange, of the history of those provenance, basically what I am writing, but because he left and he didn't publish. So it's important to publish. And then we have this type of beautiful painting, just giving us an impression of the ball when the vases were on display in the porcelain cabinet, and the painter had an impression of everything moving so fast, but the vases were standing there as big as a person, giving you this impression of everything. Today, and actually in 2019, finally the porcelain cabinet in Dresden was renovated and opened, and we see in the initial display of the renovation, there were 5 of the Meissen element vases, and then 2 of these big Chinese monumental vases, saying much about how important these are, not only for the museum, but also for an episode and episodes of history of collecting Chinese porcelain in Dresden, of collecting something transcultural and making them local. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Feng, for this fascinating preview of the history of the Dresden collections through the perspective of these vases, and also for taking on the perhaps challenging position in this panel, a sort of a bridge between the two realities that we wanted to talk about. So on the one hand, the Cameroonian perspective, on the other hand, the so-called European perspective. and for giving us that methodological introduction into provenance research and the different layers of what provenance can mean. So that was, and also explains why you are holding the fellowship in Munich right now, because you're thinking about provenance you have been thinking about it for quite a while. So right now we will start with the discussion. It will work as follows. First, we will ask individual questions to the individual panelists to sort of clear up some things. Then we will end up with a common question for everyone that sort of tries to tie the presentations together. And then we will open up for the audience to ask your questions. And I would like to ask with a question to you, Feng. We have heard a lot of the Dresden perspective on these vases. I'm curious to hear more about the other perspective. You said already that these vases were produced to be sold to Europe, but were or are Chinese people aware of these sort of appropriation of their heritage over here? Is there a conscience of, are there conscience of that already now, and was that part of the process of creating these vases all along, or is that something that sort of developed?
Thanks a lot. This is a very multi-leveled question. I like that. First of all, these objects were not considered and are not considered as cultural heritage in China because they didn't exist. Well, they don't exist in China. They were made for certain European, very powerful European collectors like queens and kings like that. And then these objects were never collected in China, so I don't think anyone in China has a claim, and these were bought. So the transfer of ownership was legit. And people who produced them, indeed, they don't have a history because they don't write, and their voices are not heard. So we don't know much about these ceramic craftspeople. I call them ceramic craftspeople because they're not really potters in our modern or European sense of the profession. They work on large scale. They work in collaboration. Everyone's in charge of a very little bit of the large process. And historical records show that there's 74 processes of making one piece of porcelain, and actually they were made in like millions. And I calculated a bit that in the 18th century already 100 million pieces were made for Europe, and let alone other places. Actually, there were more for North Africa, for Asian market. And that's the scale. So these large objects were quite special. And they're special not only because they're rare, but also because their status in the history of Chinese ceramics, they were a technical breakthrough. So this is another project I'm currently doing about eco-critical art history, about the environmental conditions and what happened during the Little Ice Age and during the coldest time period when the temperature dropped significantly from 1640s to 1680s, and the soil moisture was so low, and of course the air moisture was low too, so that the making of large porcelain objects were not possible. The experience and skills accumulated through generations by Chinese craftspeople were rendered almost useless in making large pieces, although smaller pieces were still possible. So this is another perspective to look at these porcelain vases, and if we think about them today. So that's the perspective, if I may say, from the China's perspective. But when we talk about that, I'm always very careful when I talk about China, for obvious reasons.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Except you have maybe questions directly to Feng. I would like us to move, please, to the first presentation that was given by Mambai. And you have evoked in your presentation several objects of power that are at the same time object of war, and the same time object of religion, and at the same time object of fulfilling another function. And then from what I've understood from your presentation is that the function the objects fulfills is so important and makes the object to acquire a certain position within the community or a certain status. So maybe will you like to explain more what makes an object to become really an object of power? Is that the function? Is that the historic event? Or is that something else that contributes to that status of being an object of power, especially within the community of Mafa people?
Thank you very much. I would say when a community make an object, it has a special function in this community. And it is not up to another community to define the function of the object. So for me, when we are talking about the value of the object or the importance of the object, we should not consider it is materiality. We should not consider it is value in terms of price and so on. But each object has a specific function, a specific role, a specific definition, a specific dimension in every community. And maybe others cannot, they cannot be able to say this is important and this is not important. Because the value, the essence of any object is the object itself and the link of the object to the community.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question now goes to Falk, and it seems that in the case of the crown, and I guess it might be the same in the case of the Hungarian crown, these objects seem to appear as sort of main characters in these texts. And I wonder, do you have any example of different crowns being mentioned in texts, or is it only one crown that always appears? Because it seems that one builds this narrative around the crown, but they don't seem to interact with each other in a textual way. And for us, our historians, these crowns, we compare them, we look at them together, and by looking at them together and when you were talking about the probable or the hypothesis of a Byzantine origin for the other crown, and then for the Hungarian crown, and then for the imperial crown. But it seems that in the sources, that comparison doesn't happen at all. That would be my first question, if that happens, and if not, maybe why. And then the second question would be, you have spoken about two very different aspects, perspectives on this crown from a German perspective. Are there other authors from other geographies thinking about European objects of power in the Middle Ages? Is there a narrative around that too? Because it seems that local culture and national culture on the one hand, and the otherness of these materials and the fact that they're not from continental Europe is a central aspect of building these narratives, and perhaps also building these crowns, the fact that we show materials that we don't find everywhere. But I wonder, is this a perspective that is purely German, European, or is there maybe an example that proves otherwise?
Thanks so much for these wonderful questions. So I answer the second one first, and I would start to answer it by pointing to courtly culture in the Middle Ages, which is not like regional or national in a sense, but which is in itself transcultural, not only European, but rather can be seen as a cultural system that could be understood in the Mediterranean, so to say, so in the northern and southern and also eastern Mediterranean. And it's also why maybe these precious objects play such a big role in these texts, and also why you can compare these texts very well, even if they are written in, I don't know, medieval Greek or Old French or German or sometimes even Arabic, it depends, but to the cultural context of the given text. So, but you can see that there's like a universal discourse in a way in this Kirtly setting. And precious objects, also precious materials, like gems, for example, are really important, and you have a lot of narratives about them, how they are given from one ruler to another, also between lovers and so on. So this is really, really important. And what does it mean to give such things away? Do you bind the one you give it to for a certain amount of time? How does she or he has to react and so on? These are really important themes for the text. And that's also like the context or the background in which the Herzog Ernst narrative works, but with this special focus on the imperial crown and the orphan stone story. And well, I didn't ask myself this question before, really. So someone maybe should look into crowns in medieval narratives. Like the text that I know, I don't think that they play a very important role. So it's rather special that a text thematizes a crown in such a way. But there are, like what comes into my mind from an Alexander romance of the same time, where he meets in the Far East a female ruler, and they also exchange gifts. And it's like a power struggle between them, who can give more and more interesting things. And she kind of wins. And the last thing he gives him is a crown. So it's also a way to communicate dominance, which, and maybe this goes back to your first question, which resonates with like political practices of the time, especially by the Byzantine Empire, who like these emperors really gifted or presented crowns to other kings, like the Hungarian crown, for example.
Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe just before opening up the discussion with the public, I would like to come back to the aspect of giving, because throughout your presentation, it is clear that objects of power are valuable objects. And then from China to Germany is a very huge distance. From the northern Cameroon to Basel or to Germany, the distance is still huge. And even from the Mediterranean Sea areas to Vienna, we see the distance that separates the origin of the objects and the place where the objects are now. And then maybe we have to differentiate between those internal gifts as to show maybe love or something else, and then gifts or possibly gifts that people give to other communities or to the external people, because especially from the viewpoint of the museum, we keep talking about gift as one of the cause of translocation. That is when the objects leave one place to the other. Can you maybe come back to that aspect of given objects of power throughout history? Is it something that someone just can renounce on his objects of power and say, I give it to you because you're German from China, or I give it to you because you're German from Cameroon? So I'm really interested in that giving as one aspect of causing the object to be translocated from point A to point B. Maybe someone can just answer the question from his own perspective, but that it will be interesting. Yeah.
That's, if I may, that's a wonderful question, because it hits at the giving and the scale. It's So I provide an example. Chinese porcelain in the late 17th, early 18th century were not primarily associated with China, because it's too far away and it's not so clear what they actually are. But they were associated with Dutch culture, because they were pioneering. So the Dutch royal women, they were pioneering in collecting and displaying Chinese porcelain, and they really designed and they really nailed it. They know how to do things. And also because they married around, so many of the German princes had a mother or grandmother as from the Dutch royal family, and they wanted to claim that we're associated. So they display and they collected, and then they made a little shrine, and it became a porcelain cabinet to show that we are from the Dutch royal family. Like in Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm I was claiming his title to the Prince of Orange after William III passed away. And that was 1702 when he actually, in my research, the Prussian electorate took many things from Honsellersdijk near Den Haag. And among them were these Chinese monumental vases. So they had an earlier layer of provenance. And that is not associated with the giving, but associated with the prestige that comes with collecting, and it's very specific that to display and to collect Chinese porcelain was for the purpose of gaining the power that you can get from the Dutch royal family.
Maybe I try to answer the question, and maybe already did kind of, but like the situation in the Middle Ages, from the European perspective, would be that like very precious or exotic, unusual objects or also animals were given by kings or emperors, each other, so to say, to establish diplomatic relations. So it's a kind of communication, and also it's a power communication, because it's also like a struggle who can give more, or as I said, more interesting things. And just to give an example, there was an exchange between Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen emperor, and I forgot the name, I'm sorry, but like the Arabic ruler in the Levant in the time, but I don't remember the right name. And so Frederick was presented with an astronomical watch, and his response was an ice bear. At least some chronicles say that. So even if it's not true, and it's just stated in the chronicles, you can see a little bit how this kind of system of diplomatic gifts work. And I think it's a very different situation from modernity or early modernity, where this kind of exchange system tends to change when, like, with European expansion and the establishment of some forms of collecting that weren't there before. If I think of cabinets of curiosity and so on, like there comes into play new forms of asymmetry and so on. So, and the medieval situation is probably different, especially from a European perspective, because Europe is the backwater and the rest of the world is, so to say, more prestigious, and you could also say hegemonic in a way. But this changes with the 12th century, and then there is like a process going on.
Yes, thank you. If we take into consideration the relation between Switzerland and North Cameroon, it's hardly difficult for us to talk about gifts, because the expedition was well organized and they had the necessary finance to travel to Cameroon, and the mission was to collect objects, cultural objects. So if we talk about gift to justify the collection we have in Switzerland, it does not have any place. Even if there is some gifts, it cannot be taken as argument to justify the huge amount of collections we have in Switzerland. Because I have said, the people of the mountains, only in 3 museums, there are about more than 1,000 objects in numbers from the northern part of Cameroon. I'm not talking about the whole Cameroon, but the northern part of Cameroon. So gift may be in 1 or 2 cases. But if we take, as I have said, the reason why people traveled, they traveled to go and collect. They traveled to go and collect. So there is something morally which can be, I will not say condemned, but which is there and can be considered as fact that we cannot put away. Thank you.